Hey, good morning. It's 10:15, almost a packed room, so it's a good time for us to get started. So, my name is Shashi, and I'd like to welcome you to this session on what are the top barriers to overcome with DevOps, and how can you factor them as you plan for your operations in 2017 and beyond. So before we get started, I'd like to get a quick show of hands in terms of how many of you are actually implementing DevOps today. Just raise your hands. It's good, half the room here. So some of you might, resonate with these barriers, and for the other half of the room, I'm hoping this is useful as you go through your planning cycles. I was sort of going through a quick introduction, and then we'll walk through the output of a survey. The presentation I'm sharing with you today is really based on a survey that we conducted, and we got a number of responses. And the output of that is distilled into what I'm sharing with you today. And we will go through these barriers as indicated by many of your peers in the industry, and we'll also look at some aspects of how can you overcome them. And what I want to have as a leave behind for many of you is maybe a prescriptive plan of action, especially for those of you who are wanting to get started and going down this path. And then, time permitting, we'll also have a Q&A, and I'll be around to mingle around a bit. So first of all, I am representing a company called Quali. We are a venture-backed startup based in the Silicon Valley for our business functions, but our R&D is in Israel. The focus of this company is mostly around cloud and DevOps automation and orchestration software. And we develop what's called as cloud sandboxes. These are on-demand self-service environments. And today we have about 300 plus customers globally. Many of them are large public cloud service providers that you might have heard about. We also have a number of tier 1 and tier 2 telcos, large enterprises, as well as several vendors across the industry as our customers. Moving forward, we intend to get more into the mid-tier enterprise and sort of scale up our efforts there. As I mentioned, what I'm sharing with you today is the output of over 2,000 people responding to a set of questions that we asked. And what you see here is that it was a year-long survey, so it gave us a lot of good sample points in terms of demographics, in terms of roles in the industry, as well as the time period, because as you might have seen, even for those of you who attended this conference last year versus this year, there is a degree of maturity that has come about in terms of awareness about DevOps, in terms of both the practices as well as the mistakes you make with DevOps. So we got a 12-month snapshot of a window for us to take this survey along, and the responses continue to get hardened. The good part is, there was a healthy mix of people that responded, from those that came in from an engineering background, in the sense they were people that were actually implementing, and their roles were changing, or they're being asked to adopt different practices. And then we got output from people that were in management, those who were the decision makers, those who had the budget control, and who are being asked to bring in newer practices into their organizations due to a business mandate. So it was a healthy set of responses. And why did we do this? What was the motivation of the survey? As some of you can imagine, and many of you might have heard about DevOps from a colleague or some other peer in the industry, from your manager, the promise of DevOps is very alluring, right? Because you all want to move very fast. And so initially when somebody pitches DevOps to you, it's a nice, sexy race car. You're getting into something that will help you move fast, do things that are much better than what you can do today. And it's a great ride. And the way it is pitched is, you get to move fast, you get to do good things, and you get to a very nice place, a great destination. tranquil place you can go enjoy. And that's really the vision that many of us are exposed to when it comes to DevOps. In fact, you get so much time on your hands because you get done with everything so quickly because of DevOps that obviously you get to enjoy the romantic sunsets with your girlfriend or boyfriend, right? So that's the promise of DevOps. You know, who wouldn't want this? And why wouldn't you see these conferences being so full? Because that's the magic you all want to see happen. But then what happens? That wonderful race car turns into a skateboard. Right? So that's when the reality starts to sink in as you dig deeper into what is DevOps and then start to dissect this phenomenon of DevOps. And that, you know, nice destination that you were promised, now the road to get there suddenly becomes winding and an uphill route. And not only that, you get so caught up in implementing DevOps, your girlfriend's now watching the sunset alone. Right? So this is where the reality hits in. And you know, this is the balance that we're all trying to see in terms of how do we balance the utopia that we all want to and aspire to get to with the reality of making it work, right? So that's hopefully the motivation of this survey, to understand and decouple what exactly is that barrier so we can all get to enjoy those romantic sunsets. So we got some good insights from this survey. Why do we have these barriers for rollout? So one of the key insights that popped up was, just as much as DevOps is about application, software agility, a lot of the development of software was dependent on their ability to have access to infrastructure in a timely way. So whenever there was a request made for accessing certain infrastructure for development, for setting up environment, we saw that the time that was required to return that request was in many cases weeks, and in some cases even translating into months, because it was a ticket-based system, and we had that queuing mechanism in their ability of the IT departments to service the requests coming in from the development organizations. Very few cases, you know, it was less than a day. The median was in the weeks to the months, and this was flagged as a pretty big bottleneck in terms of solving the infrastructure complexity. The second was really, as we talk about cloud today, many organizations want to go down the path of saying, hey, I'm deploying a private cloud. I am allowing for our people to have self-service access to infrastructure and to the resources that they require. But the reality is over 50% were challenged to have self-service access to infrastructure, which meant they had to depend on somebody else to go and service the request. And in 9 out of 10 cases, that request ended up being queued. And this meant you were ready to go, but you know, somebody else had to wave that flag for you to move ahead. And so this was a key insight that popped up as a pattern quite some times again. The third insight that came up was, you know, today we have so many tools that pop up when you talk about DevOps, and in the context of the landscape, the shortage for DevOps is not one of tools. The challenge is one of too many tools. And the way it's happened is, some of you might have been exposed to the concept of shadow IT. Now these things come up not because, you know, there was somebody else just wanting to go do some moonlighting on their own. It came up because of the first two insights that we shared, that there was a genuine bottleneck coming in, and somebody wanted to move fast, and when they hit a wall, what did they do? They went around the wall. And how did they go around the wall? They went around with things that they were familiar with. You're all software developers, you're all innovators, you don't want to be hit by brick walls. So you go to take some open source tools that are out there, and you get the stuff done, right? So that's good in a way, but when you have a lot of people getting stuff done their way, guess what happens in an organization? It starts to create a series of band-aids stitched together. So this was a key insight for us, and it, in some ways it wasn't a surprise, but the magnitude of it certainly was in the proliferation of the tools that we saw across the DevOps environment. A lot of people also came back, and we got a sense of which tools were used more than others. And obviously things like Jenkins popped up pretty big in terms of the survey results that we got. But there were others that were kind of close behind, and many times we had, within the context of the same organization, several of these tools used in somewhat of an ad hoc manner. The other aspects was really, if you look at what DevOps is for, it's not the end, right? It's always a means to an end. And it's a means to drive agility within the organization. It's a means to drive collaboration in the organization. And the pace at which DevOps has picked up is a result of a lot of the application modernization initiatives that we see today. And that is very well intertwined with the move to the cloud, right? So whether it's private cloud, whether it's public cloud. And so one of the things that also came about as part of this survey was when we looked at applications that were being developed and that were cloud-centric, today there is a lot of demand in the enterprise, especially those who have got on-premise deployments in their data centers, to take certain workloads and put it in the cloud. And at sometimes we always almost get a data point of 70% of enterprises that want to have a hybrid footprint, which means they want to have the flexibility of something on-premise and certain workloads in a public cloud. But the reality is we found a number of applications that were truly hybrid enabled was a quarter of that. So we were looking at about 20-23% of applications that were geared for being hybrid. And so this also gave us an indication into why there is this complexity. The move to public cloud and certain tools in the context of the public cloud were more apparent, but when it came to a hybrid environment, a lot of it was challenged. So the other aspect that came in as an insight was around application complexity. And I'm going to touch upon some of these in detail as we go through the presentation. But today you see the nature of applications changing. Architectures are evolving. What was monolithic on-premise is now starting to become modernized, microservices-based, and cloud-centric. And in that context, we found that a number of people came up with the argument that applications were generally becoming very complex. And in fact, over 50% of the organizations felt that their organizations were not in a position to have a clean movement to DevOps and agile practices because they were just bogged down by the complexity of their application architectures. And so as we went through the survey, we were in a position to sort of rank these barriers based on the pattern that we received. And we were in a position to take them and distill them into the top 10 barriers. So this slide's really a snapshot of what I'm going to share through the next few slides. But let's go through these barriers one by one, and we'll spend a couple of minutes on each one of them and see, is it something that is a barrier within your organization as well, or it's something that somebody else's problem. And in all reality, not all barriers are created equal. What might be barrier number 7 for somebody might be barrier number 1 for your organization, and vice versa. So these are really, patterns that you need to sort of watch out for and make sure that you're cognizant of them as you plan your cycles. So let's start off with barrier number 10 first. So this had really got to do with getting the support of your executives in terms of rolling out DevOps in the context of your organization. And again, here, it was a bearing in terms of some organizations were more DevOps savvy, and there was a top-down mandate to go drive it in the context of the organizations. Whereas in many other cases, it was driven bottom-up by the engineer who had a passion to go say, look, I need to go do this differently if I'm to meet the deadlines that are being imposed on me. And there was a bit of an engineering cultural shift that was required. And consequently, there is a need for executive buy-in. Anytime you need to change something, it doesn't necessarily come free. And so whether it's changing in terms of the process, or in many cases, having access to the budget, or alignment of resources. So these were areas that needed executive support. And one of the things I would share is that it was very clear that you would be much better off trying to go get the buy-in up front with some of these executives, in many cases making them either become champions themselves of the change, or appointing champions who could actually lead the DevOps movement in a much more homogenized manner. Whereas if they tried to go about and implement something and then get the buy-in later, for somebody who wasn't necessarily educated with the ethos of DevOps, even though they got the project to be successful, without the management air cover, they weren't really in a position to succeed themselves. So this is really, something to be aware of in terms of many of you who may be managers or executives. Make sure that you're encouraging, and if you are in engineering wanting to get that buy-in, do it early and do it up front. The next thing was, as I mentioned, one of not the lack of tools, but this tool proliferation, and more importantly, tool fragmentation. We saw that we were trying to determine what is the genesis, why are there so many tools? And one was obviously that there were different people subscribing to different sort of open source tooling, and these were sort of fragmented tools across the stack, and each were solving a certain use case. And many times, because there wasn't a packaging of these tools, you had to end up picking different tools to serve different functions. And this was obviously over the course of a few years. But then each of these tools obviously sort of ended up being a niche, and they tried to expand their functionality as well. So you started to seeing overlapping capabilities come across these different tool sets, and when that happened, you obviously saw an overlap in terms of complexity as well. The other thing we saw was number of these engineers within organizations were a floating population. So some were, especially in the context of DevOps, because it was an evolving field, you didn't necessarily start off having DevOps experts in your organization. You ended up looking out for the contractors who are having the DevOps expertise, and then saying, hey, can I bring that expertise into my organization? Can I bring these contractors on board? And very often, these DevOps experts came in with a sense of affinity to tools that they were exposed to, and they brought in that culture. Now, when that project was finished, they moved out. It wasn't that they were static resources, they were sort of floating population. And when they moved out and another project came about, we had another expert come in with his tools and his affinity. And we have seen in larger enterprises how this led to the tool sprawl. And here is where, again, it's important to recognize this, because one of the challenges in scaling is if you don't have standardization, you cannot scale. And so one of the key elements of standardization is not just the operational practices and processes, but also standardizing in terms of tool sets. So here I'll talk about how we can leverage certain environmental philosophies to integrate these tools in a non-disruptive way. The third barrier was around budget. So initially there was so much enthusiasm in terms of moving ahead, charging ahead even with a lot of the DevOps capabilities. And the justification made was, hey, it's free, it's open source, it's free, right? So no budget required. And the moment you say that, heads nod. Who wouldn't want something for free, especially you have that sunset picture in your mind, right? So we had a lot of these initiatives start off with the expectation saying it's free. And then suddenly you get some things done, some of the spaghetti in there, and you run into issues with things that are already there. You run into problems that you did not anticipate, scaling issues, security issues. And then the free starts to become, costly. And then you want to go and start to get some process in place. So this is where, again, from a planning perspective, for you guys who are planning to roll out or in different stages of DevOps, scope it out in a way that you understand not just the cost of the tool, but in terms of what does it take to bring a systemic organizational-wide process that you can then replicate at scale. Barrier number 7 was sort of interesting. I thought it would be much higher, but this sort of came up because originally, we saw this as a tug of war between dev and ops. That's really where you see a majority of the conversation focus today. But very soon it became apparent that it wasn't just necessarily development. There was an aspect of testing that was equally important. And today you see, as you talk about continuous integration and continuous delivery, continuous testing is actually being carved out as a standalone because of the very pivotal role that it plays. And the other aspect was around security, right? So this is an area where you want that man in the middle. You want to make sure that security is not an afterthought. It's something that's part of your planning cycles up front, because it shouldn't necessarily be a bolt-on functionality. And so when you start to look at all of these things together, then it becomes very important for somebody with an architectural point of view who can look at this holistically and say, look, here is how you connect the dots. And so these are the different skill sets that you would require within the context of your organization, and they all need to play well with each other, right? So don't just look at it in terms of who's the best software engineer that can bring in, these DevOps agile methodologies, but having this well-rounded team is really a recipe for success here. Then I touched upon app complexity earlier. This is increasingly becoming important, especially in sort of brownfield environments, or where you have an intermixing of legacy as well as modernized applications coming into play. So why are applications so complex? So today you see the proliferation of different devices, and you need this application to deliver a very consistent experience, a very secure experience, across different endpoints, across different mobile devices, and across different user and demographic profiles. And so you also see many of these applications starting to have that hybrid manifestation I talked about, and the way that they are being accessed. And all of these start to make for that architecture to be a lot more complex than it originally was when you're just looking at a streamlined client-server mechanism. So we're seeing that accounting for that early on in your DevOps process is actually a very key element that perhaps the architect and others within your organization needs to be aware of. And for those of you that are requiring to mandate to question these and make sure that you're not looking at it in the context of the application today, but where do you want to go? Because you're seeing now the same application be hosted on-premise, be in a SaaS offering, or maybe deployed in a private data center environment. And it's the same application, but a different experience that it needs to sort of manifest itself around. Number 5 was around planning. And many times what happens, you go through that winding road or you get onto the skateboard now, and many organizations get frustrated. Sometimes you don't get that budget approval, your manager doesn't understand it, so it's very natural for you to sort of get frustrated, and then you go back to that Excel spreadsheet, right? So screw it, I'm not going to muck around with all of these, I'm just going to go back to what this organization wants, I'm going to give them an Excel spreadsheet. So the main thing here is to sort of look at realistic expectations and planning. And when you're looking at planning, sort of break these down into achievable milestones that you can have short-term wins. Don't aim for what you want to achieve a year or two down the line. Aim for what can be a short-term success that you can deliver in the context of getting the buy-in within your organization, proving that the system works, and then slowly expand the footprint on it. And just as you would do in the context of any other major project, I think there's no other approach than a common sense approach here. Just bring the DevOps, just bring the planning practice into the DevOps movement, because early on the challenge with DevOps and the reason why some of the projects were conceived as failures was because they shot first and then aimed. And what I mean by that, people went and implemented stuff and then realized that it didn't fit that organizational structure that was already in existence. So planning shouldn't necessarily be an afterthought. Drive it very holistically. So from here on, it starts to get more interesting, and maybe here on you also see things starting to happen when you scale. Some projects are more shorter terms, some are well bounded in terms of the scope. But now in a larger organization, you start to hit certain boundaries and ceilings when you take certain successes and start to scale those successes into organization-wide practices. And that's when certain problems start to appear, which you might not necessarily have foreseen. And one of the biggest problems that we've seen is in terms of having access to environments. And today, as I mentioned, especially if you're developing applications and in brownfield deployments, you could conceivably have infrastructure, physical, virtual, that you need to have access to. The application could be in the cloud, on-premise, or in a hybrid environment. We talked about the tool change, the need to maintain compliance. So again, as you shift the posture of the application, as you change the architecture, are you still maintaining the security posture? Are you still, in the context of at least the US regulations, are you still HIPAA compliant? Are you PCI compliant? Are you meeting the DoD standards, FIPS standards? So you need to be in a position to have access to an environment when you make changes, and change management is key here. The entire infrastructure is still certified and it's still compliant to some of these regulations. So one of the things that we've seen is also how static is the environment versus how dynamic are the changes. And having access to these dynamic environments allows you to predictably bring in a set of best practices that anticipate the changes that are going to occur. And a lot of the challenges in really giving developers and testers holistic access to these environments early on in this cycle rather than later on when you're much closer to production. Because guess what? It's always easy to fix things closer. When you shift left, then you go to the far right. And the thing that popped up is standardization. Many organizations are looking to see how soon can they standardize when you're in the left side of the spectrum, more closer to the dev test rather than to ops in production. And that's where the notion of templating, blueprint comes into play, because if you can standardize those elements upfront, then it allows you to scale, and you can manage complex environments much more quickly. And so that's really something that is underway in a big way today. And today, many testers who were previously responsible for bug fixes, feature level testing, are now suddenly being asked to say, anticipate the problem that is going to come in when I roll this out. And because the environments are becoming very complex and hybrid, it is hard for them to conceive of these problems because they just don't have that holistic point of view. So this is where, again, you need to adopt principles like continuous testing as you go down the path of integration, because guess what, they'll come back and say, I cannot really test these elements unless I have access to a much more holistic representation of what's in production. This was our barrier number 3, and again, here you start to see the the organization's profile itself, because today you have a number of organizations who are just getting born with applications that are cloud native, directly on AWS or Azure. But for a number of organizations that have invested in data center, on-premise applications the last decade, they just can't turn that big ship 180 degrees overnight. So it's a considerable amount of investment that has gone in. And so it's a bit of preserve what they have, make sure that that's working elegantly, even as you start to experiment with newer workloads and you want to change your application architecture. And for DevOps to succeed in such organizations, and many of these Fortune 1000 organizations have this issue, it's big for them, is how can you integrate what you have today with where you want to go? And can you take our legacy infrastructure, legacy tools, a lot of operational processes, monolithic architectures, even as you bring in these new agile practices, even as you move towards DevOps. And so it's a transformation. It can be painful at times, and it has to be done in a very graded, gradual manner where you start to really slice out the things that you want to prioritize and go with things that are low risk, convert them into wins, get the learnings from that, and then you start to move towards things that are more mission critical and more riskier. But then, eventually in some organizations which have taken the lead, and I've seen this more in the context of financial services organizations, which surprisingly have taken on a very leading role in here, even here in Europe and Germany, as well as in the United States, because they view this as a huge differentiator for themselves in the financial services sector. Then number two, again, for us it was not a surprise, but for many that we shared with, it was something that they hadn't necessarily thought of was as big a problem. And it had to do with test automation. A lot of times you're able to generate code quickly, get something going, but unless you're in a position to go test it out in a holistic way, more often than not, it used to result in problems that had to be fixed in production where it was much more expensive to fix it. And automating the test environment itself was a bit of an afterthought in the DevOps story, but now it's actually getting a lot more leeway. And today you're also seeing the need for developers and the test teams to more actively collaborate to make sure that this activity is a success. Otherwise, there is a lot of rework involved, which is something that is very expensive for an organization moving along. And for this activity to be successful, it is important to expose these test teams to as much of a holistic representation of the production environment as possible, right? So that's really where a lot of effort is underway today, and we see this working in tandem with the organizational dynamics to really bring these two teams together. Okay, so before we get to the first barrier, any guesses on what barrier number one was? Culture. So in many ways, it's no surprises, and it's predictable, but it's also tragic because a lot of DevOps is you see as this is being talked about as the intersection of people, processes, and tools, and things like that. And culture is always less about tools, less about any processes, and it's more about the people. And guess what? People are the hardest to change. You can bring in technology into your organization, you can mandate a process overhaul, but then to get somebody to change the way he's operating, or he has certain preconceived notion, or she has preconceived notion, is something that takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of organizational mandate, it takes a lot of executive support, it takes a sense of shared responsibility and accountability. So this is something that you could get all the other barriers resolved, but then there has to be a conscious effort to addressing culture within the organization. And it usually is, again, bi-directional. You have a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach to ensure culture across the organization is mandated. But one of the ways of doing it is to initially overcoming the resistance to changes in culture. And to do that, you have to elect champions who will act as evangelists within the organization, who will drive these processes. But you also need to set up teams for collaboration. Sometimes, you want to aspire to change culture, but you don't necessarily change the way in terms of how teams collaborate. And without that, there is no sharing of best practices. There is no sense of shared responsibility. And there is a lot of finger pointing that comes into the mix. So here is where culture and efforts to change it can break down the boundaries within an organization and truly enable them to succeed with some of these practices as they move ahead. Okay? And then culture also comes in when you start to break down the silos and bring in certain tools and technology that also help you break down that silos. Because if you have a certain sense of development tools, methodology, process that encourage people to continue to work in their respective silos rather than something that has a feedback loop into it, because you want to get the insights, feedback, and plow that back into the organization in a loop, so there is a self-healing happening along the way and a lot of learning happening along the way. So that's where these elements all come together. So with that said in mind, I wanted to introduce a couple of things with regards to how you can take these barriers and at least what are we doing to help shape that narrative. So one of the things we talked about was having access to infrastructure in a timely way, getting access to environments that are as close to production as possible, and exposing them to developers and testers. So one of the things we do is really help build those environments up front. So this could be a combination of physical virtual infrastructure. It could be data. It could be containerized applications, service APIs, tools within the organization, and sort of bring them all together in a stitched format as a self-service environment. And what we do is we allow you to take all of these and design them as blueprints, and the blueprints are published into self-service catalog. And this is usually done by an infrastructure admin or a blueprint designer. And once it's published into a catalog, then the catalog can be accessed by developers and testers within the organization, and they can tweak it as they see fit and then activate that blueprint, in which case it becomes a live environment which is representative of what they need to develop for or test against. And there is a lot of sophisticated modeling capabilities within this blueprint, in the sense you can bring in anything that is legacy, anything that is modernized, and model that in a way that it inherits those attributes. We also take care of sort of the networking between all of these components, connectivity and things like that. And there's a lot of intelligent analytics. So when you activate it, what kind of resources are consumed? What is the costing model? What kind of analytics can you draw from it? So all of these become very apparent. And then you can do it in the context of a GUI-based approach, where somebody has a drag and drop of the different components that you can layer over into the blueprint. Or it can be accessed through a RESTful API by something like a Jenkins. And the whole concept is, you take any environment that you want to expose and bring it up front, blueprint it, and deploy it as a service. And guess what? It can be deployed over any cloud, on-premise or in a public cloud environment, or guess what, also in a hybrid environment. So we do it today on VMware-based environments, OpenStack, Azure, AWS, even bare metal, or a combination of these two clouds. And it's a design that blueprint once and with a one-click deploy anytime. So that concept of on-demand self-service environments is something that we believe will help drive that agility. And at the same time, it's about achieving balance. Because today, the reason why we're all going down the path of DevOps is to move fast and in a predictable way, because the businesses are demanding that we move fast. Now, when we move fast, we don't want to impact quality adversely. We don't want to induce risk into the system. We don't want to compromise on security, or we don't want to drive up costs. So how do you get the balance of moving fast while ensuring that quality is not compromised. So that's where, the notion of the sandboxes or environment as a service is that fulcrum that allows you to achieve the twin objectives in a balanced manner. And the reason it becomes important is, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of fixing an issue when it's in the design stage is very minimal. When it gets to the implementation phase, it's almost 6 times as much expensive. When it is in the testing stage, it's 15 times as expensive. And when you get into the operational aspects of deployment and maintenance, it's 100 times as expensive. Okay? So where do you want to catch and fix this? And today, because of the complexity of the environment, it is usually not in the design phase, because the design phase, you still have somewhat of a siloed view. The sweet spot for this is around the system or environment testing phase, where it is still controllable in terms of cost, but it is much more accurate in terms of ability to fix it, because you have a much more holistic representation there. So this is one of the reasons why the notion of environments is becoming important, but also integrating it in the context of continuous testing, having its own pedestal to stand upon, is extremely important. And one of the things that, as I mentioned, we could do to do this is really look at it as a journey towards automation, because we're talking about DevOps automation, we're talking about cloud and software. And this can begin anywhere. It can begin in the context of your R&D labs, it can begin in your data centers, it can begin on your journey to cloud, and it can be even in the context of release management, where if you want to bring in a true standardized way of delivering environments, then you need to know what's in that production phase, what is in that production IT environment. And typically, as I mentioned, there's an infrastructure or application owner who is responsible for looking at that inventory, figuring out what is there, figuring out what assets are there, and looking at a user to group mapping. And once that's done, what we could do is, look at modeling and automating them for the full stack: physical infrastructure, virtual, database, applications, tools, services, APIs. And once you have that in place, now you know what's in that environment, and then it's taking snapshots or slices of those environment and exposing them as blueprints to the developers or testers that need to have access to it. So you end up creating these standardized blueprints, publish them into self-service catalogs, so that initial barrier that we saw about 4 weeks to more than a month of somebody waiting to get access to that environment or infrastructure is completely gone. This is a design once philosophy, and from here on, it's a matter of minutes to access that environment. And once you have that active environment, then you can do what you want to do with it over any cloud infrastructure. And this is where the blueprint consumer comes into the mix, because he's not responsible. He doesn't want to be worried about the infrastructure. He doesn't want to understand what is underneath. Absolve him of the complexity. Just let him work at his pace to do whatever deliverable is mandated to put out. So that's where it absolves that complexity for them, allows them to just go deploy based on any cloud architecture. And again, for the infrastructure owner, they get very meaningful insights across that entire workflow. They see who's consuming what infrastructure, over what cloud. It can be from a user perspective, application perspective. It allows them to have a much more holistic view of what the budgeting needs to be, but more important, what is working and what's not working. And you allow that to refine themselves into best practices across the organization. So one of the key takeaways is, how can you drive standardization? You can do so with blueprints. And it also has the subtle narrative of bringing together those silos that we talked about, because it allows people to collaborate without trying to drill into their mind that, hey, you need to change your culture. Because the culture element of it is subtly changed, because everybody is now in a position to so easily work with each other in a collaborative manner. So egos go aside, and allows organizations to scale much faster. So this model is really useful if you have a 50, 100 developers or more, or testers in that organization, because then level of productivity starts to increase, And typically, you see that some investment in here is a 5x return in terms of ROI, in terms of the productivity gains as well as the speed with which you can move. And what we have also done here in the context of our offering with the sandbox software is integrate into other tools in the ecosystem. So we talked about the tool fragmentation, the complexity that is a barrier. And our objective here was not to introduce yet another tool into the system, but rather to non-disruptively integrate with whatever you have and bring that in the context of a sandbox that could be set up or torn down. So it could be something like your test framework, it could be release automation with the likes of Jenkins, it could be configuration management tools like Puppet or Chef, or artifact repositories. It doesn't matter because your IT environment is unique to you. And if you can have a representation of that and you expose that early on to your developers and testers, then you get to reap the benefits of it. So that's really been the objective of the environment and services on demand. And one of the key use cases, particularly in the context of DevOps and release cycle management, is today many of you are familiar with Jenkins and the pipeline process that it adopts. It could be any of these other tools which are in the release deployment phase. And today when you start to look at the pipeline process, then you have the different stages of dev, load, security, integration, staging, and production. And many times, it invokes environments, and it's largely based on some scripting that is not necessarily automated. And what we found is by bringing in these environments and automating it and allowing them to be invoked through RESTful APIs from plugins such as Jenkins, and offloading the creation as well as the teardown of those environments, we can have releases go up to 5 to 7 times faster and with almost 2 to 3 times improvement in quality. So again, it sort of balances the ability to move fast without compromising in quality, because you're in a position to sort of go through and automate the setup and the teardown of those environments, which may be unique to each stage of the pipeline process. And that's something we're actually even demonstrating today, and it becomes a very cloud agnostic offering. So with that, I'd like to just share some parting thoughts. For those of you who are already well along your DevOps journey, kudos. You may be a few steps into your journey, or you may be further along. And as I mentioned, there are different problems that you'll encounter depending on how your organization is set up, how many people are working, and where you are in terms of scaling your DevOps activity, because the kind of problems you get when you scale are completely different than the problems that you get when you're setting up on the journey. So some of the takeaways is, first of all, simplify that environment complexity and try to standardize as many things as possible in a conscious way upfront, because then you don't need to rethink a lot of things when you're ready to scale. You've already set those building blocks up front that will let you take those learnings and scale in a much more graceful manner. And secondly, as I talked about, it's always easy to introduce newer technology, but you need to, along with management, change and provision for the cultural aspects of things, because you can get all the other things right, but if somebody's always shooting down and there's finger pointing, then it's not going to go anyplace. And to do that, you really need to figure out a way to let go of egos in many cases, and in some cases I've also heard that there are issues around job security, because somebody says, hey, I'm used to doing things a certain way. If this guy coming into my organization, he's asking me to go here, is my job going to be taken away? And there is a bit of resistance that creeps in, which is but natural. And so some of these need to be thought of, and the human element is as important as the tools that you embrace, and how you you bust those silos without necessarily coming across as threatening to people's job or conveying the impression that there's a huge amount of change is very vital. Everybody wants to resist change unless it's beneficial to them, and they don't know it's beneficial to them unless they see it in action. So again, look at in the context of these how cloud sandboxes and environments can help, because it really addresses all of those three issues as you begin your DevOps journey. What we also did was, for those of you who'd like to just keep this as a reminder, we printed down these top 10 barriers and put it in an infographic. I'm going to share these with whoever wants to pick this up here. Or you guys can come by our booth and take a look at the demo and share your thoughts as well. I'd be interested to share and listen to your thoughts. It's also downloadable should you want to share it with any of your colleagues. It's nothing other than common sense, and it's a sharing of best practices that your peers have taken the time out to share with us. And as I mentioned, we have some of these that we're demonstrating, so do come by our booth in the hall. And should you want to contribute your learnings, your best practices, take 2 to 3 minutes out to share your thoughts in a survey that we're doing this year. And we have a much more refined version of the survey, because as this space is maturing, the questions that we were asking last year may not be the same questions that we're asking this year. So we've upgraded our question set as well. And it really doesn't take too much of your time. I would say 3 to 4 minutes at best. But it's when you start to take these 3 to 4 minutes from different people and then you look at it across thousands, that's when these patterns starts to emerge, and that's where you can share the collective best practices. And for those of you who are sharing, we do have some incentives as well, so I'd love for you to stop by. And so with that, let me just conclude. And I hope this session was useful for you, yeah? And see if there are any questions, would be happy to handle it as well. Thank you.